that is the saint or holy man Moses, in the modern country of Syria. This is just a little north of Damascus, up in the mountains. The paintings were done about 1,000 years ago, and they represent a form of Syriac Christian art because they're Syriac Christian inscriptions around the head of the Apostle Mark, as well as on the painting of what he's writing down and copying. Now, if you saw the movie Da Vinci Code or read the book, you may be aware that there are not only the canonical Gospels, but there are things called the non-canonical Gospels. There are series of written texts that are referred to as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of the Ebionites, the Gospel of Judas, the Diatessaron Gospel, and these contain teachings about Jesus that were recorded in the 1st and 2nd century, but which for various reasons were not placed in the canonical collection of the 4 main gospel writers. In fact, it's been archaeological excavations that have oftentimes brought fragments of these non-canonical gospels to light. On the left-hand side is a fragment dug up by Yale University in the Dura Europos excavations in Syria during the 1930s, the fragment called the Diatessaron, or the Gospel of Harmony, which seems to have been an attempt to take several different gospel traditions and fuse them into a single coherent narrative. While on the right-hand side is my photograph of the Gospel of Thomas, which is today housed in the Coptic Christian Museum in Cairo, Egypt, and was excavated in Upper Egypt at a site called Nag Hammadi, and represents a very early book. In this case, the Gospel of the Apostle Thomas, the fellow who's sometimes referred to as Doubting Thomas. Well, I have to be really careful because I could end up speaking for days about the archaeology of the early artifacts found at Christian sites in Egypt, in Syria, in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. Certainly my favorite site to talk about, and one that will show up on your final examination, is an archaeological discovery made in the 1930s in the country of Syria at a site called Dura Europos. It's called the Dura House Church, and dates from around AD 150 to 222. It was an individual's private home which had been modified, with the courtyard still used for receptions, but the room to the left of the courtyard was an assembly hall for prayer, and the room to the upper right corner of the courtyard was a Beth Kadeshe. That's the Aramaic word for a baptistry, the room for giving of the soul and the name of an individual. Well, what's really fascinating for me is not only to look at the artifacts that were found in this early house church, but also to look at some of the inscriptions on the wall. Line spreading out from it, and it's an equal arm cross, much like those ones I showed you earlier in this lecture coming from Egypt, the Coptic ones. And then to the left of that we make out the Greek letter D. I know it's going to look like a giant B to you, but that's a D, a delta, and then the letters A, B, A. I believe someone who knew how to write Greek was trying to spell out what an Aramaic-speaking Christian was saying, and that was deraj, the door, the earliest representation of a cross, and then of this early Christian sort of a mixture of Greek Aramaic, and both of them slightly misspelled and abbreviated, reference to this church this as a place, the doorway to the Father. Is some of the earliest Christian art preserved anywhere, dating to the 2nd century AD. And the frescoes were very much done by loving hands at home. They had not hired the great expert painters of their time, but it attempted to paint scenes from the biblical stories that were significant to them, using only a limited number of colors and some skills that were pretty challenged. Here we see a painting from the Dura Europos House Church inside the baptistry area of a group of men in a boat. Unfortunately lost his head is Christ, and he holds his hand out to Peter, who is attempting to walk on the water towards Jesus, but is having sort of a moment of faith failure and is beginning to sink into the water. It's another story, and that is the story of the Good Shepherd. And indeed, the interpretation is that the shepherd is the representation of Jesus. And he holds on his shoulders not a little baby sheep, but a pretty large ram, as well as a herd of rams that he's sort of trying to keep track of. So it's funny, in later Christian art, Christ as the Good Shepherd is almost always shown holding some cute little cuddly lamb. But in this case, our earliest representation of Christ as the Good Shepherd shows him wrestling with a pretty tough, large male sheep. A lot about how Jesus' teachings were difficult in some ways for his followers to learn from, because he taught using a method called parables. And that is, he would explain a story about people who sounded so real life that you could almost guess they might be your neighbors or members of your family. But he never named the individuals in his parables. He left them nameless. And he left us to conclude what was the truth behind the story that he was sharing. That idea that a parable might have multiple interpretations is called the idea of multivalency. That a parable may have more than one meaning based upon your economic, your social, your gender position within a society. For example, there's a very famous parable of Jesus in the book of Luke, in the 15th chapter, a parable called the prodigal son, or more appropriately, the lost son. It's within a collection of 3 stories about lost things. And this painting, by the way, by Rembrandt, which is in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, shows the father re-embracing his prodigal son, the son who had taken his portion of the inheritance and gone and squandered it and lost it. And here the father rejoicing that the prodigal son has returned. While on the other hand, to the right-hand side, you see the older son, the son who never left his father, looking a little peeved about the entire situation. You know, it's interesting. I'm the oldest son of 3 in my family. And every time I heard the story of the prodigal son being preached in church, I always leaned over and looked at my little brother, the youngest son, and realized that, indeed, he was probably going to fulfill that very story. And indeed, in life, he has. And you know, much like the father in the prodigal son story, the youngest son, after wasting a lot of time and money and making a fool of himself, returns and the father forgives. And you know what's interesting is there's a servant within the story. There's not a mother. And some have suggested that Jesus' original telling of the story may well have had a mother who was watching and looking out and attempting to serve as a go-between between these sons and their father, so that this boy would not be lost. He would not die from neglect. Well, you know, it's really interesting is that talking in my own family, I oftentimes realized that my father had a different view of this story than I had, that my mother had a different view of the story than my youngest brother had. And that is, to each one of us, there was something to be learned, something that we would take and incorporate in our own lives. To tell my father to be forgiving, to tell the youngest son that even when things were worse, you had to come back home and things could be forgiven. To tell me as an older brother not to be sour when kids waste a lot of money and dad forgives them. And to tell my mother, she always saw herself as that servant, that she had to be there watching to see the right moment to make sure the prodigal son found his way into the house. Well, there's more interpretations to this parable than just those. But indeed, the multivalent nature of the stories that Jesus told opened up the whole question of how to interpret these teachings. In fact, that's one of the reasons that the non-canonical Gospels were largely excluded from the New Testament. And that was, in some of the stories they presented, they either left the parable uninterpreted, or they gave an interpretation or teaching that went against the teachings in those 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The last idea I'm going to leave you with in this presentation, and you better pay attention, it's going to be on the last test,